Now, if I were to deliver a response to the State of the Union address, Herman Cain handled the Tea Party, Mitch Daniels handled it for the Republicans, I'm going to handle it for you people. Well, not all of you people, but enough. My response, Mr. President, you managed in your speech to use the word I 45 times, but you never mentioned our budget deficit. You managed to tell us what we should or should not do 28 times, but you never made a reference to cutting spending. You used the word I 45 times, but never in the context of lowering spending or cutting our deficit. Every time you use the word I, it was in the context of introducing a new government spending program or new government regulation. And during your entire speech, Mr. President, you never once, one time you used the word liberty. One time you used the word freedom. We have a country that was founded 230 years ago on the basis of liberty, economic liberty, and freedom. And in your State of the Union address, you used each of those words one time. And you should know that on the readability test from the University of Minnesota, your speech was the third most dumbed down State of the Union address since 1934. Good job, Mr. President. You're really speaking to your core audience. And may I address a few of the specifics you mentioned in the speech last night? You said in the last 22 months, businesses have created more than 3 million jobs. Mr. President, why didn't you mention that during the last 22 months, actually only about 2.2 million jobs were created? You got your number wrong. But during that same period of time, 5 million jobs were lost. Was that a teleprompter glitch, Mr. President? A net loss of nearly 3 million jobs. There are fewer Americans working today than there were when you took office, Mr. President. And we've been birthing Americans and had immigration going on during all of those years. There are many more Americans now than there were when you took office, Mr. President. But there are fewer people working. Our labor force has shrunk from a participation rate of 64.6% to 64% in just 2 years. Mr. President, do the American people know, or do you want the American people to know, that if the same number of Americans were looking for jobs today as they were when you took office, that our employment rate would be closer to 11%? Do you want the American people to know that? And Mr. Obama, you said, this is your quote, at a time when other countries are doubling down on education, tight budgets have forced the states to lay off thousands of teachers. Well, it didn't take us long to do the research on that, Mr. President. And the research says we actually have more teachers in the classrooms now than ever before. More than ever before. The number of teachers has increased faster than student enrollment. Does that really make sense? From 1971 to 1984, the number of students in government schools declined by 15%. The number of teachers increased by 7%. In 1955, Mr. President, the number of students per teacher was at 26.9. That figure is now at about 15.6. It seems, Mr. President, that the higher the student-teacher ratio, or I should say the higher the number of teachers per student, the worse the system works. Maybe the real problem is behind bloated administrations. But you didn't reference that, did you, Mr. President? And how about this one? You claim that right now American oil production is at the highest it has ever been, or highest it has been, in 8 years. Mr. Obama, why didn't you mention that on public lands, the lands over which you have direct control, oil production is down by 40% since you took office? Yeah, there is an increase in American oil production, Mr. President, but that increase has taken place on private lands, not government lands. And oh, how you must wish you had the power to go to these private landowners and tell them that they cannot exploit the minerals and oils that lie under their dirt. But you can't do that yet. So that's where the production has increased, Mr. President. I mean, you're all into fairness. Wouldn't it have been nice, Mr. President, if you had told the American people that right now, while oil production has fallen by 40% on federally owned lands, thank goodness, the private sector has picked up the slack to bring us a net increase in oil production. And then, Mr. President, you said, I've approved fewer regulations in the first 3 years of my presidency than my Republican predecessor did in his. I know that your core voters, Mr. President, might not understand this, but it's not the number of regulations, it's what the regulations do. According to the Heritage Foundation, Mr. President, during your first 26 months in office, you imposed 75 new major regulations with costs to the private sector exceeding $40 billion. And during that same period, 6 major rulemaking proceedings reduced regulatory burdens by an estimated $1.5 billion. So that's still, Mr. President, a net increase of more than $38 billion in the cost, the economic cost of the regulations that you have pushed on us in the first 3 years of your presidency. No president has ever burdened the businesses and individuals of this country with a higher number and higher cost of regulations in a comparable time period. And you also claimed, Mr. President, I will not go back to the days when Wall Street was allowed to play by its own set of rules. Once again, you are dumbing down reality to meet the prejudices of your core voters. Wall Street does not play by its own rules. Wall Street plays by the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission and other government agencies. Wall Street and the banks also play by the rules of the Community Reinvestment Act. Tell me, Mr. President, and you're including the banks, I assume, in Wall Street, if the banks were playing by their own set of rules, would they make loans, real estate loans, to people they knew could not pay them back? Why would a financial institution playing by its own set of rules make a loan to somebody they knew had a bad credit history and did not have enough income to pay that loan back? There's only one reason, Mr. President. And that would be because government regulators tell the bank, you must make that loan if you wish to stay in business and avoid prosecution and persecution at the hands of the federal government. And besides, We'll buy the loan from you. So what do you have to worry about? Is that what you call Wall Street playing by its own set of rules? And, Mr. President, you had a lot to say last night, a lot to say about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Why didn't the name Barney Frank ever cross your lips? Excuse me, Mr. President, that's probably not a great visual. The words Barney Frank and crossing your lips in the same sentence. Why didn't you mention Chris Dodd? Why didn't you mention that in 1993, in 2003, in 2004, in 2006, and again in 2007, George Bush, your predecessor, tried to rein in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, predicting exactly the type of financial collapse that eventually happened. And why didn't you mention that it was the Democrats and Barney Frank and Chris Dodd who stood in the way of these reforms? Because it suits your narrative, Mr. President, to blame all of this on Wall Street, the one percenters. That makes your friends in the Occupy camps happy. And of course, whenever you attack people who are making high levels of income, it makes your core voters happy. And then, Mr. Mr. President, your blatant misrepresentation of the truth, your blatant obfuscation of details when you said that Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. You know, Mr. President, that you have twisted logic and fact on its head to present that figure to the American people. You know, Mr. President, that Warren Buffett pays exactly the same tax rate as his secretary pays on the same amount of taxable earned income. You know that. And you know, Mr. President, that Warren Buffett's secretary pays exactly the same tax rate on her capital gains that Warren Buffett pays. And you know, Mr. President, that when you raise capital gains taxes, the government gets less revenue. And our deficits go up. But since you didn't address deficits in your speech, and since you didn't address our national debt in your speech, I guess we can assume that these issues don't matter to you. So why raise the capital gains tax? Again, Mr. President, pandering to class envy, to that huge segment of the American public that you have stirred into a cauldron of hatred and envy towards successful people in our society, all for the purpose of exploiting them, keeping them under your thumb, making them dependent on government, and making sure that they will vote for you in the next election. Congratulations, Mr. President. Your dumbed-down speech at an 8th grade level may well have accomplished its goal out there. You may win re-election playing the class warfare game. America will most certainly lose. And thank you very much.
The truth hurts. 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year on this radio show. He's the high priest of the Church of the Painful Truth. This is Neal Boortz.
Well, golly. Oh, that was fun. Let's do that again. Wow, okay. Recall is coming up.
Boortz!